Hello, and welcome to the Visible Women Podcast. I'm Corinne Corbett, and along with co-host Kim DeBrew, we put issues related to diversity, inclusion, and appearance in the spotlight and examine how they impact the lives of women of color. On today's show, we're going to tackle, two subjects in one. So first, we want to talk about, perspectives from different generations, because clearly we're not millennials or Gen Z. And even if we have the spirit of a millennial or Gen Z, we do not walk in their shoes. So we can't really say what they think or feel. As much as we want to be young, we're not technically there anymore. So the other thing we want to talk about is visibility in faith communities. So we want to talk about both of those things from that perspective. So I found some Pew research that is about younger millennials who identify as Black. Now, this show is about women of color and visibility, but it is Black History Month, so I'm going to talk about Black folks. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is that belief in God among younger millennials is high. It's at 72%. And the importance of religion is at 58%. It's very important to them. But then when you go to attendance at religious services, it starts to drop. It's at 42%. That's at least once a week. But frequency of prayer is more than 58%. And that's at least daily. So just because millennials are not in church does not mean they're not praying. But participating in religious education groups is at 25%. Meditation at least once a week is at 32%. Frequency of feeling spiritual peace and well-being among younger millennials who identify as Black is at 57%. And that's feeling peace, spiritual peace and well-being at least once a week. But then frequency of feeling wonder about the universe is at 49%. And this last one, I'm gonna say, belief in absolute standards for right and wrong among younger millennials is 21% believe there are no clear standards. And I think that is a good basis to start a conversation, because I think, as again I said, we're not walking in anyone else's shoes, and there are some reasons why these percentages are as they are. So we brought an expert on to the show today. We are so delighted to have Minister Candace Simpson, who is a faith and justice educator. She is an associate minister at the Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Brooklyn, New York. She is also somebody that both of us have known since birth. So she's our candy girl. We've known her for that long. We are in awe of the young woman of God that she has become, but she's still one of our nieces and church babies when it comes down to it. But she is going to teach us or instruct us or be in conversation with us about, faith, being a millennial, and walking that path, and what that's like, and how we of other generations need to commune with and understand different points of view and make room for them to have their own experiences in houses of faith. So welcome, Candace.
Welcome. We're happy to have you.
Hey. Thanks for having me, y'all. This is so much fun.
Awesome. It's going to be a great conversation. Some of the pre-conversations we've had and exchange we had, one of the things that struck me is how in some ways the faith community historically has had this generational thing figured out, or at least on the surface it has. There are currently probably 4 generations, maybe 5, depending on the expanse of a given, let's say a typical African American congregation, 5 generations maybe in the congregation, figuring it out together, worshiping together, engaging in activism and social justice and ministry, and finding ways to work, to be supportive of one another, to be really about the business in community. And what seemed awesome for me as I thought about this topic is, how do we figure out how to model this within the faith community? What can we learn that can be modeled outside of it, right? As people are looking for answers for how to just manage and show up in the world, like, what can we learn from how faith-based movements and institutions are doing it? So we're thrilled to have you. And really, my first question is, what are you noticing in the work that you do on the ministerial staff, the work that you do in social justice outside of formal institution? What are you noticing about the generations and how they are making it work?
What am I noticing? So I think one of the most pressing things that I notice is that, and so I will be speaking as I'm a Black woman who was raised in a Baptist church, a relatively progressive Baptist church in Brooklyn. And also I've spent time in different movement spaces. And because I have an appreciation for church, and that church taught me how to love Black people and all parts of myself as a Black person, I noticed that we're speaking the same language, or we're talking about the same ideas, but we're using different language. So what I notice is that the folks at Concord who taught me, to sing, lift every voice and sing, the people who taught me about Kwanzaa principles and to sing, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. That same language is present in social justice movements. It's present in pop culture. It's been present in this latest wave of activist energy that we call the Movement for Black Lives, kind of nebulously. But as a whole, I think we're saying the same things. But the difficult thing is that this latest wave of, I would say, activist energy is not, though individual activists might have their own spiritual practice, they might be Christian or they might not be Christian. I would say that this movement does not have its hub or a footing in the church. So the people who are really moving this movement forward, folks who are on the ground, like grassroots organizers, it's a lot wider than, the Dr. Kings, the Malcolm X's, the kind of charismatic male figures that we've been taught about. This latest wave of activist energy, it's very queer. It's very diasporic in the sense that we're, from all over. And because of that, I think that we run into some conflict, not because folks don't, we run into conflict. So the folks who are really leading this wave of energy of movements, it's also the same group of people who have been systematically and structurally oppressed and pushed out by the church. So there's a reason why, we don't have mass meetings at big churches for activists. The reason why is because these activists have not been lovingly embraced and appreciated, respected, honored by the Black church as a whole. So we're talking young women, we're talking formerly incarcerated people, we're talking queer folks. These are people who have not historically been well loved and well appreciated by the church. So therefore, I find in my work that I love to be a bridge. I love to connect folks. So if the church can host, an action or host a movie screening, if we can kind of open up our space to be in service of people who are doing direct social justice work, then I love, connecting people to do that kind of stuff. And I noticed that whenever we open up, people say, oh, well, I didn't know that we could do that here. Or like, can we curse? Like, like people, they're reverent and also like really just taken aback that a church would open up space. And so that's the first thing that I noticed, that like this is really a hard movement to pin down one leader. And I think churches, just the way that churches are structured, rely upon knowing who the one leader is. And because it's a lot more nebulous, a lot more collective, it's difficult for folks to do that. But the other thing that I noticed is that people are tired, self-included. We have never had a workforce that has been so under-resourced, overworked, underpaid compared to what living wage is. We've not in recent generations. There's no place in the United States where minimum wage is going to support a one-bedroom apartment. So you definitely can't buy a house. And our labor is tending more towards like contract and the gig economy. So everybody has a hustle. Everybody has shea butter they're selling. Everybody has a nonprofit. Everybody has, their thing, which is I personally think it's great until it's not great. And so, when we talk about people who, and I listened to some of the statistics that you shared about people not coming to church. And I know a big part of that is A, people are tired. And B, we're living in a world where Sunday is not a day off. It's not an opportunity for people to rest. People have to pick up shifts. And especially for young Black folk, we weigh our time a lot more intentionally because we're trying to pay back student loan debt. We're trying to live in these cities that are safe and exciting and attractive to us. And just trying to establish ourselves in like a super it's not a secure market. So I think a lot of us joke about our anxieties and our depression and our mental health pretty openly because there's just this sense of not being secure, not knowing what's coming next due to bigger factors like the market and debt and other things.
Yeah, that's real stuff. And I think that your point about the gig economy lands for me because that's not just for young people. That's for people like me who are not in the corporate space anymore, who have to become entrepreneurial. The corporate world doesn't look at people past 40. So there's some commonality there that we too are hustling for our lives. And so there's common ground there and there's an understanding because we're tired for different reasons. But I think also there is the way that we see the role of worship has shifted. In, let's say, the span of your lifetime, there were periods where people were there all day. And, for most people that it's just not, a lot of people can't do that anymore. So there's been a shift away from, let's say, the pageantry of, an afternoon service all the time and some of the other things that went along with that, dinner downstairs, somebody serving dinner or club meetings. But that doesn't mean that the work or the ministry has to suffer. It just has to shift. And my question to you is how, and this is not just about Concord, this is about many churches and faith-based institutions, and don't have to be churches. How can faith-based institutions welcome younger voices and younger ideas from younger members to shift the work so that it is meaningful to all.
So when I was in seminary, I did my thesis on womanist ethics and freedom school. So my project, my task, I was trying to figure out what are some womanist methods that are present in freedom school related to ministry, activism, and teaching, which for me are like 3 strands of a very sacred braid. And when I was doing my research, I found this book by Clarence Taylor on Black churches of Brooklyn. And his argument was that there was this boom of Black churches, in the 1940s, 1950s, not because people were more pious, not because people were more respectful, not because there was something special about this generation, but because the church served as a social welfare agency. So as people were migrating from the South and looking for ways to connect up in Brooklyn or Harlem, wherever else have you, the church was a touch point. So people would come from the South. And I mean, I'm sure we could think about, names and faces that we're remembering from Concord, people who share this story who it may have been that one person from the family went at a time up north and then sent for the rest of the family. But the church filled a gap that other social welfare agencies just were not for Black people at that time. So the lesson that I get from that is that when the rest of the world has counted us out and when the rest of the world has systematically and structurally excluded us from meaningful participation in the economy, in the workplace, in cultural movements, we do our own thing. And that's what I love. When people ask me, why do you stay in the church? That's the reason why, because it's a building that we own. It's a space that we control. It's something that belongs to us that we can shape as a community. And so I think if we're, trying to, I don't think that the things that we need to do in 2019 are the same things that we did in the 50s and the 40s. But I do think that the spirit of that activity, which is figuring out what it is that people need and desire, and then meeting that need. And I think that's going to take a lot of work on our part as a whole. I do a lot of consulting work, and, I consult with churches who are trying to figure out what they might call the LGBTQ thing, because a lot of churches are struggling with even the basics of what does this acronym mean. Mm-hmm. Church trying to figure out what are some respectful ways to refer to strangers that you may be meeting for the first time. And the thing is, it's really simple things that I think can have meaningful impact over time. So I just think that there are ways that we could be more welcome, more thoughtful, more loving, more compassionate. Little things like, if a young family comes to the church, they need a place for their children to sit, or they might want, our ushers are really good about giving families, a little coloring page with some crayons, and like, if the child starts crying, it's okay, here's the baby room. Like, we already know how to be hospitable in certain directions. And I think we have to continue to learn how to be hospitable in other directions. So that's my biggest dream for the church is that we can just be a credible, trustworthy place where people know that they can experience love, where they can experience material blessing. So not in like, you get a car, she gets a car, everybody gets a car. But, that we really connect with one another. And, if this is what people did in the 40s and 50s, When people came up from the South and they knew about a house that was for rent or they knew of a job that was open, let's put people on. Let's make this a place where people can experience a holistic blessing. Because I think that's what people are drawn to community, and they're drawn to places where they feel loved and respected. And sadly, a few months ago, the conversation about church hurt was going pretty viral because everybody has a story about, even if not in the church, somebody who goes to church who, is the loudest. I'm a choir member, I'm an usher, I serve on this ministry, I do this club, blah, blah, blah. We've experienced some really unkind Christians in this world. So, I don't know how much we need to hold on to the pageantry of the past, but I do think that communities flourish when they have something meaningful to look forward to. Like for us, for me, I'll speak for myself. I love Freedom School at Concord. It's something to look forward to. Like the whole church gets excited every year about the fact that there will be several wonderful, beautiful, brilliant, thoughtful, smelly, hilarious, sarcastic children in the building. And when we have our closing program, that's a night when people come out to support, because programs and events and things to do and just a positive break away from all the nonsense of the world is it's just so welcomed. And it's something that people need to sustain really ugly time.
I'm so glad you shouted out Freedom School, because as you know, I sent my now 12-year-old up to Freedom School. So instead of sending her down south for the summer, I sent her up north to really be in community with the folks that raised me, the folks that I think instilled in me not just a deep, abiding faith, but a sense of faith in action. That, my faith is not something that I wanted to keep to myself, but to really move towards, helping others make their lives better. I want to reflect on something that you said when we first kind of asked you what you notice. And one of the descriptors you came up with was, we are tired. So the coach in me saw and heard the weight of that, the weight of what it's like to be really untethered from an anchor. So, if the result is depression, as you said, if it's anxiety, I'm wondering what kind of the big impact, generational impact that untethering has. Because what I will say is that I first learned how to give a speech, giving in a Sunday school play. I first learned how to speak on a mic, which I do for a living now, in Memorial Hall at Concord. And so it's a place for affirmation. It's a place, the sort of the organized structure with all of its warts and harm, frankly. It served that meaningful purpose, I think, for scores, for, thousands, hundreds of thousands. And I'm wondering whether, it doesn't matter to me whether it's organized, faith-based communities or not. It can be, one-off, whatever. But I'm wondering if our younger sistren are finding that those places of affirmation in the same ways. If there are spaces where they can practice in safe vulnerable ways, if they have more seasoned sisters who can say, girl, you got this, you got it, you can do it. So what are you seeing in that space?
I think you're right about, just how this not being connected to any place, whatever that might mean, faith-based or otherwise, can kind of have us just drifting. What I appreciate is that, and I know there's research to back it up, but my peers are a lot less, there's a lot less stigma around therapy and seeking mental health professionals, counselors, psychoanalysts. And I would even say that there are people who rely on different sorts of spiritual healers, people who practice African traditional religions. I think we're a lot more open to different ways to connect to not just the divine or the universe, but also ourselves. So I'm grateful about that because with all this trauma, generationally and in this moment in time, it's important for us to have healthy spaces where we can unpack and rest. But I will say that, if I think about in the course of a week, I see my friends several times in a week. And it wasn't always like that. I had to intentionally carve out time to do that. So there's a group of young adults that I'm not the leader of this group. We're all co-conveners of this group. And it's called Group Chat. And we get together and there's no agenda, there's no expert, there's no program. We just intentionally carve out a time during the week where we can look at each other in the face. And we've read poetry together. We've laughed together. We've cried together. We've processed some really frustrating news. So we're trying to build a community in that sense. And that's been really meaningful for me. And there are a bunch of other spaces where people are doing similar kinds of intentional, do you like this thing? I like this thing. Let's like this thing together. I also realized that I don't know if this is a trend that's happening now or if my peers and I are getting to the age where we're trying to save money, but also we want to see our friends. So I'm noticing lately that rather than going out to dinner, going, to the bar or to a restaurant, we're leaning more on dinner parties or brunch parties where, you might bring tacos, I'll bring some drinks, we'll get together and just share space in that way, which I'm finding that a lot of my peers are a lot more on the Martha Stewart end of things than they kind of give off. So I'm thinking of one friend in particular. We went to her house and she served us bacon wrapped dates and there was some sort of cheese inside and it was just wonderful. And I'm oh, we're so grown and adults. Yeah, but when you talk about being on the microphone and speaking and learning how to present in front of, a company or, your workplace, I'm finding that people are using, of course, we could say social media. People are, with the advent of internet, and at least for now, relatively open internet. If you wanted to start a blog and kind of test out your voice and see how people react to it, I'm finding that people kind of, everybody has a blog. Everybody's writing things. And I don't think that has the same impact or consequence as, speaking at a Black History Month program. But it is a way that people are learning to just seek a place that's for their voice. Because also in many churches, the people who get the speaking parts are, the churched kids. So, the ones who can read off the paper well. And that doesn't always happen, but I'm finding that social media kind of democratizes or makes more accessible the microphone. And so plenty of folks have podcasts and blogs, websites, projects. I think my concern is how are we setting up space for people not just to speak, but also to learn and to be in dialogue with. So that's the difficult part of it all, I think.
I would agree about the democratization of that the internet has brought democratization. And it allows us to just like take a phone, hit video and turn it on and start talking. But there's a difference between speaking out into the void and speaking to one another. And what I want to see how we get to a place there is, and it's wonderful. I like the fact that folks your age are creating spaces in which to share information and to share your feelings and to talk and process things, because that is critical. But what I am looking for is the spaces where we connect more intergenerationally, but no one's in charge. So if someone of my generation invites someone of your generation, then it looks like, okay, we're inviting you to our thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes with a different kind of expectation. Okay, I'm going to go, but it's not my thing, and I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to be or process this. Where if there is, when you talked about being a bridge, a generational bridge that allows for open dialogue and understanding, I think not only in faith-based communities, but in communities at large, there could be a better understanding of where we stand and what we have to do to find mutual respect. But also for us, what is it that we need to learn that we're not seeing? In terms of, we talked about teaching churches about the use of pronouns, for example. Like some of that stuff people need help with, and they don't know where to go. And so creating that kind of space and being thoughtful about that generational chasm, because that's what it is. It's kind of like this kind of void that you kind of like make assumptions about one another and you're not really sure. And then there's a little bit of judgment, whether we want to admit it. There's a little bit of judgment on each of our parts about how we're living, and how do we get over that? Not like you're going to have all the answers, but I just am interested in hearing your perspective about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's when we have to really open up our imaginations about what we think is sacred and what we think is holy. What makes something sacred, or what makes it holy? So for me, you probably know this, but and actually, speaking about intergenerational relationships, so Shahara, for other people who don't know, she was my first grade teacher and one of my first babysitters, and also came to be my big sister in our shared sorority, and just somebody that I've always looked up to and admired. So whenever I think about the Wiz, I think about her, because I remember she took us when we were children to see this local school production of The Wiz, and I had always loved the movie, but seeing it in person, like I'm getting chills now thinking about how I felt when I saw it in person, and so I'm thinking about that as sacred, that experience as sacred and holy, because she took the time to, take us. And there are so many people whose names I'm thinking of, faces I'm seeing in my mind's eye, who took the time to, invest in us and, do something fun with us. And I think what's difficult about intergenerational relationships is that people think that if you put an elder and a young person in a room together and you just, set them off, that they become somehow intergenerationally related. But I think we have to, consider what is it that, for example, the 70-year-old and the 27-year-old might enjoy together. And I think, again, that's why I'm a little bit of a Bible nerd, because that text is holy, because it opens up opportunities to share stories, share blueprints. There's a lot of really funny stuff that happens in the Bible, a lot of really shady things that happen in the Bible. So that's why I like that. But right after, I don't call him the president, but the man who believes himself to be the president, right after his inauguration, I found that I was just feeling all kinds of I felt like I was going through a romantic breakup. Not because I was in some relationship with our last president, but the feelings of betrayal, of disappointment, of wondering if you're worthy, if you did something wrong, or how could you have done something, what else could have been done? How could we have saved this? All of those feelings started to well up within me. And so I turned to what is a holy and sacred text for me, which is Beyonce's Lemonade. And when I listened to that album, I was like, okay, I can't do this by myself, because I need some other Black women and some other Black femmes who might want to just process this with me. So I just put on Facebook, does anybody want to watch Lemonade together? And a very good friend of mine who works at Auburn Seminary said, we'll sponsor it, we'll be the space. We got somebody to watch kids. We got food, so that, if we're going to have an event for Black women, we want to also take care of the concerns of Black women. So nobody had to worry about getting a sitter. There was a safe person who was, coloring and playing games with the children. And we got together and we watched the Lemonade movie. And there was about 20 of us in the room, varying ages, varying life experiences. And it was very few things feel like church to me, because I'm a church kid. But that moment really felt like church. I mean, there were moments when people were crying and moments where we were just kind of in our feelings as Black women in this country, knowing that our demographic, even though we have complicated and complex feelings about Hillary Clinton, we showed up and showed out to vote for her across generations, across, life experience. People really, Black women specifically, showed up and tried to save this country from that man. And I don't know what life would have been like with her as a president, but the thing is, we just don't know. But just being in that space, all of us together, it kind of affirmed for me that we need multiple ways for people to process these really intense feelings of abandonment, neglect, especially as women of color, especially as, for us as descendants of slaves or descendants of enslaved people in this country. So it was just really sacred for us to do that. And it did affirm for me that even, there was someone in the group who didn't really care for Beyonce, but she wanted a night to just be with Black women. And we did evangelize, and we made another convert for the Beyonce kingdom. So that by the end of the night, she was, excited about Beyonce. So, I feel pretty good about that.
So it's funny, I never thought about this podcast potentially being a space that feels sacred. And yet now, thinking about it, one of the things that I think happens for me when I am in conversation with Corynne, just you and I, or with our guest, our wonderful guest, Candace tonight, is that I think we are here for it. We are here for each other. We see each other, right? And in deep, meaningful, impactful ways. And that's kind of like is what's required, right? To create, kind of that sacred cylinder, as we call it sometimes in coaching. So thank you for that. I had not thought about this particular work in that way. And in so many ways, I feel like I am in the complete wrong generation, even to be in the podcast space. So love to know that everybody's doing it. So I can just be one in the number, and I don't have to fret over every word I say and every I add to our dialogue. So Candace, thank you. I had one last question. I know our time is flying by. We thought of interviewing you for this because your name came up in a book event I was attending at Washington's National Cathedral maybe 5 months ago. And I asked the author, who is she reading? Who's she listening to? Who's she following? And she said you. So I'm going to ask you that question. If our listeners are really trying to better understand kind of how they can make deeper, more impactful connections with folks in the queue behind them, if they're trying to be supportive, if they're trying to be allies, who should they be reading, listening? Like who matters to you in the space right now?
So I don't know if you really want to do this with me because I have this like rotating library. I'm at any given moment reading 10 books at a time. And I'm grateful for, I'm thinking of Miss Rice at the Concord Elementary School, who was like, you always got to have a book. Just always bring a book.
She was my third grade teacher, you know that, right?
Look, she got us all through. I know you can hear her voice, like, bring your book and 3 sharpened pencils. Like I can hear her saying, like, so a book that I think is really accessible and it's not expensive. And I think she does a good job at defining her terms and telling stories is Charlene Carruthers' Unapologetic. And Charlene, I think for the last 5 years, was the national director of Black Youth Project. And Black Youth Project 100. That might not be her exact title, but Black Youth Project 100 is an organizing collective that moves from a Black queer feminist lens. So these are the people in New York locally who are responsible for the Swipe It Forward campaigns, or partially responsible for the Swipe It Forward campaigns. And they also do like all sorts of like actions related to just an intersectional approach to Black liberation. So what I like about her book is that it's, for me, as a very churchy person, it reads like an epistle. Like she writes as someone who is deeply involved in this movement, and she's sharing advice, she's sharing challenges, highs, lows, from a very like deeply vulnerable place, which I really value. And I think especially for people who are trying to get a handle on like, what is this movement for Black lives saying? What do y'all mean? Why do y'all, what's your strategy? What's your platform? What do you believe? What do you care about? It's a great book for that. Another person who is not my peer in age, but I think kind of speaks prophetically to this moment is Octavia Butler. And she was, oh my gosh, like a prophet. You talk about like just a prophet. So the books that I think really helped open up some imagination, and also kind of like, I couldn't read it at night because it was too real. But Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which is this, like, it's a novel set, actually maybe a few years from now. But she just writes with such precision, and she actually says that the president of the time ran on a platform of Make America Great Again, which, it's related to some other kind of breadcrumbs throughout American history. But so the way that she just predicts, I think she passed in the mid-2000s, but the way she predicts the way that white supremacy and racism and homophobia can have really ugly impacts. And when I read about her process was she just read the news, like she read NPR. And she said that the way that she was able to, quote unquote, predict the future is just read the news and imagine what the most extreme, like if we do not intervene, what is the consequence of our action today? Which I think is just a great way to orient ourselves in general. So I like that. Who else am I reading? Oh, the last one is Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategy. And I like her because she draws a lot of wisdom from like nature, mushrooms and yeast and birds, and tries to get some wisdom out of how living things that live in community, how they communicate with one another and how they survive because they depend upon one another. And as an organizer and someone who's like deeply spiritual, I just think there are a lot of challenges that she offers us, especially in the way of communicating and being clear and being kind to one another, which is really difficult to do in general, but especially when you're trying to save the world. I don't think we really put as much emphasis on how we treat one another and how we go about conflict and negotiate boundaries and all those things.
Well, I think that was a great list. I am a big Octavia Butler fan. Big. I love her books. I'll go back and read those. But what really struck me about this conversation is that this is like a takeaway for me. When we talk about, kind of what is sacred and it is one of the biggest things is that we have to expand that definition. If we are to succeed, in understanding one another, the first thing we have to do is understand what is sacred and what is sacred. And then from there, it is creating a different kind of faith-based community. Yes, churches is outside of the church. Yes. Everyone does not go to church, but for those who go to church, you may find that in church. But how do we create a community of sacredness outside of that? And that's where you build this intergenerational community, this connection, intergenerational connection. Because I don't even want to just limit it to a sisterhood. It is this intergenerational connection that is more deep and meaningful, that does not, is not limited to a Sunday or a specific day of the week. It's not limited to a specific subject matter, because in the way that we approach things, if we're approaching things with respect and kindness, that conversation can be sacred. So that is eye-opening to me in terms of just expanding a viewpoint. The second thing is that in order for us to truly connect across generations, we can't stop learning. We can't stop reading. And even if you read something, you need to go back and read it again so that you get this understanding of where we are and are open to hearing the perspective of someone else. And I think that is a critical move. So even, if you're listening to this podcast and you're saying, well, they're having this conversation about faith and church and I don't go to church. Well, this is about creating a connection, and whatever connection works for you, these rules still, not rules, these suggestions still apply, because it is also not being rigid about the rules of engagement, not being rigid about you have to do this, you have to do that, and being a little bit more open to learning how to connect in the heart and mind to someone else. This has been a really enlightening conversation. We can't thank you enough, Candace, for being with us today. It has been an incredible honor to have you with us today.
Thank you. This was like the best way to end my night. I'm just really enjoying the questions. And like I said via email, sometimes people say they want to talk about generational gaps or what have you. I'm like, Lord Jesus, we got to talk about this. But I appreciate just the spirit in which, these questions are crafted, because it's coming from a place of like curiosity and like honor and mutual respect. And just trying to figure out, how do we do this thing together? So I'm just grateful for the safe and brave space y'all have already created.
That's our show for today. Look for the latest installment of the Visible Women podcast every other Wednesday, where we'll tackle issues and experiences that relate to appearance, diversity, and inclusion that are relevant to your life. Check out our website, visiblewomenpodcast.com, where you can find out more about the episode and follow us on our social channels. Make sure you join our Facebook group to participate in discussions about our latest episode. Until then, here's to all the visible women out there. Never forget that we see you.